And you're live.
All right, everybody, welcome to a joint hearing of House Education, Senate Education, and House Commerce today on February 25th, 2025. Our topic this afternoon is career and technical education in Vermont and recommendations for governance and funding. There's some history here as to some studies that have gone on. But I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to the Secretary of Education. Welcome, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education, joined by my colleague, and our consultants, HEd Consulting. I'll allow them to introduce themselves for the record. You can go first. So, Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Hi, Justin Silverstein with Augenblick Polation Associates. We are a Denver-based consulting firm who's been helping the AOE and have done other work around CTE in Vermont. Jen?
Hi, and I'm Jen Piscatelli, also with Augenblick Polation Associates. I'm happy to be here today.
And I'm Ruth Durkee. I'm the State Director of Career Technical Education at the Agency of Education. And I'm dealing with car problems this week, so I'm in a location where I'm still learning how everything works.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. We're really looking forward to this conversation. Career and technical education is a priority for the administration. We look forward to sharing the research that the team has done over the past 2 years, along with recommendations related to funding and governance. This proposal intends to really make our career and technical education a central pillar of our education system. Within this proposal, we have the intention of expanding career and technical education and providing earlier exposure for students in middle school that is built into the funding formula that has been recommended. Additionally, this identifies opportunities to improve our overall governance to ensure that there is consistency in terms of quality of programming across the state, and also enhancing the level of support for the career and technical education centers across Vermont. So it is very much a comprehensive proposal that looks at funding, governance, along with really understanding how we can strengthen the relationship between sending schools and the tech centers so that all students are able to explore these opportunities in various high demand fields and industries in Vermont. We have shared with you 2 documents that have been uploaded to the website, which is that. The first is a brief. This is a high-level summary. We'll use this to walk through today to share the main components of the study and the associated recommendations. And then there is a more detailed report, which we can dive into where you have specific questions to explore those components. This work was done in coordination with our partners at Augenblick Associates, which I refer to as APA for convenience, and has involved a lot of our career and technical educators across the state in forming this proposal. So the work of the study preceded the broader transformation recommendations. And so what we'll highlight for you is areas where we feel those recommendations still hold, and then where there's opportunities to make some refinements that have been reflected in the policy brief in consideration of the proposed district model related to a foundation formula. So we'll make sure to note this as we go through. But we see that this proposal is really strong in creating that connectivity between the sending school and the tech centers, ensuring that they're resourced at a high level, thinking about the shared responsibility of a student that is pursuing a concentration career in tech ed. So there's intentionality around funding the entire system. I'm thinking about the sending school along with the tech center, and also being thoughtful around capacity at the Agency of Education, and also support that maybe needed beyond that for on the ground training and curriculum support and so forth. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin and Jen to walk through this policy brief. And I'll ask them to walk through it quickly, and then we'll open it up for where you have questions so that we can dive into those areas in the more comprehensive.
Great. And I just requested to be able to share so we can just kind of show you where we are.
So the hand is off.
Great. Just so you can see where we're walking through, I'm going to start out with a little bit of background, and then Jen will be covering each of our sections on governance, so both on the current system and the proposed system, and I'll be covering both our sections on funding. As the secretary mentioned, this work really is building on work that APA has been doing in the state for about 2 years. We had the Act 127 study that we did for the legislature, which had two kind of big recommendations that really flow into this work. One was a recommendation of looking at either a single CTE district or 3 regional districts, and then also changing the funding mechanism around CTE. As Secretary Saunders mentioned, the work we did then and the work we've been doing in the past year with the department and CTE stakeholders was really thinking about those recommendations and how we can put some, more detail on them. But it really was focused on the current K-12 governance system and funding system. And so what you'll see in the policy brief is how we've mapped those recommendations that you'll see in the full report into where we think they really fit with the larger 5-district proposal and a change to a foundation formula. So we can talk about any places they might not align, but for the most part, the work is really aligned to map over well to this approach. The difference being what we're recommending here is a CTE BOCES. So really it will focus both on helping, funding will flow through the BOCES. We'll talk more about that. The BOCES, though, are really there to support the CTE centers as they are today. So we expect all the CTE centers would remain, and that we really are focused on a shared responsibility. And so when we say that, the focus is on student success, student opportunity, equity of student opportunity, but also statewide workforce development goals. And that really takes alignment from the sending districts and schools, working with the CTE centers, the BOCES really supporting those centers, and the kind of theory of action, pulling the things up from the centers that make the most sense to be done at a statewide level. So creating efficiencies and effectiveness. And then all of that being overseen by the AOE to really ensure quality in the system. So I'm going to give it to Jen to talk about the current governance system quickly. You guys have experience with that. I'll come back with finance, and then we'll go into our recommendations.
So just very briefly, we wanted to provide a quick overview of kind of the current lay of the land for CTE. As you likely know, there are 17 CTE centers serving students across the state. Each serves students from multiple sending high schools. And there are 3 distinct governance structures among those 17 centers currently. 11 of those centers currently, they live within an existing SUSD. There are 4 that are regional technical center school districts, their own districts. And then there are 2 independent schools that also provide public CTE. This structure has allowed for a lot of customization, a lot of responsiveness to local needs, but we've also seen there's some inequity in program access and program quality for students. There's a lack of consistency in policies across the system, and at times the alignment with post-secondary systems and pathways and state economic and workforce development goals is not as strong as it could be. AOE, of course, oversees the entire system, but we've seen that the current staffing doesn't provide sufficient resources to fully monitor, provide support, and ensure alignment with those statewide goals. In Vermont, CTE is really focused on those 11th and 12th grade students. There are pre-tech programs throughout the state, but again, they're provided by each center, and so there isn't an equity of opportunity for pre-tech across the state. And as we know, many states are moving towards more career exploration in middle schools. There's no, kind of coordinated statewide middle school programming in Vermont currently. So Justin will talk about the current funding before we dive into the proposal.
So you all, have a background in the funding, but I think it's important to highlight a couple pieces. And some of these will stick around and some of them will not be there with the proposed funding system. So I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that CTE is funded through their full-time equivalent students. And so part of that is because you have centers who provide half-time CTE and some centers provide full-time CTE. So we're looking at the proportion of time those students are being served in the centers. And then it's also important to remember that the current funding system funds on a 6-semester average. And so basically looking at the last 6 semesters, the average number of students who are in the overall center and distributing each of those students out to their sending districts. What that really does help with is some of the declining enrollment issues. If there is a decrease in CTE students, that can help. It can be a bit of an issue if you actually have growth, though there is some supplemental assistance funding for those centers who are experiencing growth. When you look at the actual funding, what you're really looking at is a multi-tiered approach. So in 2 of those 3 governance systems, we have budgets being developed in districts for those 11 districts who are those 11 centers who are in host districts. Their budgets are part of the overall district's budget. In the 4 regional centers, they have a separate budget. But either way, what really is happening is that a multi-tiered set of funds are coming into the system. So there's a supplemental assistance grant that's coming in. It's providing some it's providing some funds for different positions. We also have some transportation funding. But overall, what you really have is a set of tuition rates that are being charged out to each of the sending districts and a different set of ways that those are paid for. So each of the centers gets their total budget. They divide that total budget by that 6-semester funded FTE count. That creates a per student amount. You back off federal assistance and a couple other funding streams that are highlighted here. And you get to basically the amount I think of as what you would charge an out-of-state student. So that's kind of the cost of the system that you would charge an out-of-state student. For in-state students, you then also back off the supplemental assistance grant, the tuition reduction grant, which is that 6-semester average times 35% times the state's base funding. Those are dollars coming off the top. That then creates the actual in-state tuition amount being charged to the sending districts. That, of course, is then paid for in 2 different pots. There's a set of on-behalf payments that are coming from that come out before the dollars go to the district. So they are dollars that are allocated to the district in the funding system, but go directly to the CTE center. And then the last set of payments really are direct tuition payments from the district. And that's effectively that full tuition amount minus all these amounts, including the on-behalf payment. What's ever left is what the district will pay directly to the CTE center. Again, all that's really based on each district's 6-semester average going on. So what have we seen as some of the impacts of kind of this governance structure in this funding system? What we really see is a large variation in resources available to CTE students across districts. When you look at the per FTE amounts that are being spent at these districts, you can have almost 100% difference in cost that we can't find is directly related to the actual program levels being provided by the CTE centers. We know, and we talk about it in our first report for the legislature, we talk about it more in this report, and we heard about it in Listen and Learn tour. You have a real tension between sending districts really wanting to support students going into CTE, but struggling to provide robust course opportunities for those kids who stay back in the sending high school. And then you also have districts, needing to have guidance support, graduation support, making sure students are getting that diploma. So there's costs that remain at the sending district that they don't necessarily have the resources to cover as they pay tuition up to the CTE centers. Jen?
Right. So in the proposed system, which Justin just mentioned is a BOCES, and we first want to start by saying this is a different type of BOCES than the one that most people in Vermont are familiar with, where districts choose to join a BOCES and there's a fee for service associated with it, that we're actually proposing the creation of a statewide BOCES for CTE. So all districts in the state would be part of that BOCES. Districts, wouldn't pay a fee to join. They would just be part of it. So this governance model is intended to be a simpler and more consistent approach. For it to work well, there need to be well-defined roles for stakeholders throughout the system. And so we outlined a few of them here for you, that, AOE retains its current responsibilities for monitoring compliance with federal and state funding, for data management and reporting, for coordinating the state-led professional development and support that it currently does. So AOE's oversight responsibilities remain intact. That the CTE BOCES really becomes the entity that's overseeing all of those centers in the state. And so we envision that the directors of the CTE centers would report to the executive director of the BOCES, that the BOCES would create a coordinated statewide Perkins plan that the districts would contribute, that the centers would contribute to, developing that plan. But instead of 17 separate Perkins plans, there would be a single plan for the state. The BOCES would distribute funding to centers. They would, create common policies for hiring, for contracting, for all of those administrative functions. The CTE centers would remain responsible for all day-to-day operations as they currently do. So the directors of the centers, they're still overseeing their staff. They're still implementing the programs. They would be contributing to the development of that Perkins plan, as we mentioned. We do see the need for a sort of advisory or governance board of the BOCES, ideally with representation from from the 5 districts, both from the administrative side and from the school board side, as well as additional representation from workforce development and other parties that make the most sense. And that board would be the one that's responsible for hiring and evaluating the executive director. Sending districts, they retain their students as students of record. So they are still, as they are today, providing the high school diplomas for all students, including CTE students. They would continue to provide the counseling support, coordinate special education and any English language services, giving CTE students access to extracurriculars and athletics. And a key piece here is that those districts would be responsible for helping to coordinate transportation with the BOCES to make sure that students can get to and from the center as needed. We do see that there would be some increased efficiency by centralizing, HR, finance, contracting. So rather than each center contracting with post-secondary institutions in the state or other groups, there would be a single contract that covers all centers. We think this could help improve the coordination between the centers and sending schools with, common admissions criteria, additional student support services available to students in the CTE centers. We also see that this single governance entity, then the BOCES would be able to provide increased support for teachers and programs. All teachers in the system would be operating on the same calendar. And so professional development could be offered where teachers of similar content across the state would have the same days off in order to collaborate together. We also see that this would, that they would provide curriculum support and development, and then all of the budgetary responsibilities would be remapped as we mentioned. The ultimate goal of all of this is to help Vermont to be better able to articulate and achieve the state level CTE goals. strengthening program quality, improving student access, really providing a unified and prioritized voice for CTE across the state. And so then I think, Justin, that leads us into the funding.
Yeah, I think one piece I
components.
want to mention here, and I think Secretary Saunders mentioned it also, the BOCES would also really be overseeing these additional opportunities that are built into the base cost. I'm sure everybody has memorized every piece of all of our different policy proposals. But in the base cost, there are additional resources, both at a per pupil level and a staffing level to have CT opportunities in traditional high schools and middle schools. So getting this started earlier, having some of those additional pathways to really get students ready to go in 11th and 12th grade to the centers. As far as funding, we do envision that the funding would go to the CTE BOCES, and the BOCES would work with each of the center directors to build the budgets for those centers. The amount that would be going to the CTE BOCES, we are estimating in FY25 dollars at $25,000 per student. The way that would be funded, and I'm going to go down here, is a little bit similar to what we're talking about today. There is an assumption that 8,000 of the base funding, which was set at 13,200, would go to the CTE BOCES as an on-behalf payment, similar to what is happening today, and that there would be an additional weight in the foundation formula of 17,000, which would also go to the BOCES to get to a $25,000 per FTE going to the BOCES. That does mean that over 5,000 in this proposal would stay with the sending district. And really that is, again, to go back to what we talked about earlier, covering a lot of incurred costs on guidance, support, making sure the diploma, and also trying to offset some of that tension around opportunity at sending schools. As you pull students out of the school, it can be harder to have other robust course offerings in those schools. We took a look, to get to this dollar amount really from current expenditure data. We looked at median. I think, as I mentioned before, the variation in per pupil or per FTE spending in the CT centers is pretty broad and not, again, directly related to kind of quality and outcome or even program type. And so we focused here on this number in FY23 of around 23,000, took a really kind of thought through inflation and also just ensuring that you would have kind of the robust opportunities you want for kids. And that's where we got to the $25,000 per FTE. One thing we really do want to call out is that the dollars we talk about don't talk about the kind of current conditions and future facility needs in CTE. And as part of all this planning, that's going to be a big part of what needs to be considered. And so we are ready for some questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so we can see you all.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll go to questions then, unless you have anything further you want to add. So I'd like to just go to the BOCES concept again. When we've talked about BOCES in our committee, that's been met with a little bit of skepticism of creating and perhaps an unnecessary level of bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And I would say to this, why wouldn't all these functions just be housed in the agency rather than in a separate BOCES?
Mr. Chair,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
for our gratification, could you just let us know what a BOCES is?
BOCES
We don't
stand
deal
for
with that in commerce.
Boards of Cooperative Education Services. In most states, sometimes they're called educational service areas or agencies. It's a way for, in some areas, it means it's a way for districts to get together and sort of, you could foresee with highly specialized services to students, special ed students, for example. A group of districts get together, they operate their own therapeutic school when none other is available or none other is available locally or it's too expensive. That'd be one example. In New York State, BOCES is very much tied with the idea of CTE. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's essentially a way of creating a cooperative that's in a formal sense. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. So BOCES rather than housing at the AOE.
Right. You raise a really important question, and this has been an area of a lot of conversation. internally at the agency and also as part of these broader meetings with our tech centers. I think the idea here, I think we know, is that there's more capacity is needed to support our career tech centers. And so this proposal, as we walk through, is really identifying what roles make the most sense to have at the Agency of Education, what roles make most sense to have within the new central offices in the district, and then what additional specialized services and support may be required beyond that, and how do we get to scale? And so those are all of the questions we've had to arrive at this, and I'll allow Ruth and Justin and Jen to kind of expand on that. But this is a really important part of the conversation. I think there's broad consensus that we need to ramp up capacity, and that needs to occur certainly within the agency, but we're also talking about getting to scale in a way that's going to achieve quality, which we think the BOCES could offer, or specialized way to achieve that, and to support that across Vermont at all 17 tech centers. I think it's an important part for us to expand, but I'd like to stay on that topic because I would like for Jen and Ruth and Justin to provide their reflections too on how we arrived at that based on some of the input we heard too.
It'd be very helpful to have a, for instance, this would be easier, better delivered by a BOCES than by the agency.
Ruth, I'm happy to start on kind of where we are coming from after 2 years, and but I think Ruth has some really good detail here. I think kind of first and foremost for us was looking at the pattern of staffing at AOE over time, supporting CTE. And our understanding is that there used to be, I think, about a half-time FTE for each program area, really robust staffing. So absolutely, like some of this could happen at the AOE. But what we know, and this isn't a Vermont specific comment, that we know nationally that funding can go up and down for a Department of Education. And so if you're gonna try to build this really robust overall statewide system and have the support sustain over time, we thought having the BOCES, linking that to the funding system, so it has, its central office is going to be funded by that $25,000. There's not going to be additional dollars. It's going to have the responsibilities and the sustainability to make that happen. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think you can always think through the white hat, black hat approach in all of education, right? So I think AOE and the staff are amazing. I think building the relationships on some of the decisions that need to be made day to day, having a director you're working with versus perhaps the AOE who is also your person, the agency holding you accountable, can create some ability, I think, just to have more robust conversations and move forward a little bit more quickly. So those pieces for sure. The overall scale of the system, you're absolutely right. I think you could think through AOE or the BOCES. We think long-term and looking at the past too, that the BOCES creates the most flexible and robust system to get it going. And it also means that the AOE isn't owning things like payroll and HR and all of that for all of the CTE system. Again, not that they couldn't, but we really see a lot of those responsibilities pulling up to the BOCES, and that's their focus day to day. And Ruth, if you have anything to add.
Ruth, would you like to expand?
I have a couple of things to add. I think Justin's really right. I think a lot about that separation, right? Because there are times when the Agency of Education really has to play that compliance role or that monitoring role or that accountability role in a way that a BOCES would allow for internal operations systems, transparency, honesty, evaluation that might not work as well were it an agency role. I also do think about the agency staffing levels and how we design a system that is secure and funded and appropriately resourced, regardless of a variety of other factors. And I think too about the fact that we have current systems where what we know students need can best perhaps be made by people who are working together in a system to provide cohesiveness in those supports without other demands on their time. So I just think a lot about if we're designing a system focused on students, what do students most need to be successful, and what's our system to ensure that any system design supports students and teachers in the most effective ways. Those are just some of the things I think about, but I do think we've discussed this extensively. And I think right now, there's been consensus. And I think Justin and Jen, my sense is that's also where we have consensus from CTE centers about the fact that they're looking for that separation in some way so that the agency's role is defined in a way that provides support and technical assistance and monitoring, but not necessarily day-to-day operations.
Great. Thank you very much. I hear a good endorsement there of BOCES and a well-staffed and resourced agency of education. Senator Weeks.
If I could, thank you, sir. If I could follow on the same question. I'm sure in your analysis, you looked at districts with CTE leadership embedded inside each district. Why did you not choose that model?
We had a lot of conversation around that because, as you know, moving towards this model, the districts are larger, so you will have more robust central office. But when you actually look at the number of students that are in CTE, it's still really hard to get to scale, given the number of students that we're serving in CTE. And so the thought is within the central office, you do need to have dedicated staff that's supporting that oversight and kind of being a liaison with the BOCES and supporting that connectivity from middle school into CTE. But then to really get to scale and have the highest quality world-class CTE center, it makes more sense to have one governance system. But we had that conversation. Should our student population grow exponentially over the next couple of decades, maybe that could be revisited. But it's really about scale. Getting to the 5 districts, there's a different opportunity to get to scale for K-12 than there is for CTE, which is focused on those 11 and 12 graders, about 5,000 students. But this is definitely part of the broader conversation, and I would love for Ruth to weigh into that as well, because I know we went back and forth on what's the right approach. It really comes down to scale and thinking about quality and consistency across the field. Ruth, anything you want to add to that?
I think Justin articulated another point yesterday that I may ask him if he can articulate again, so I'm not trying to do it for him. But the point, Justin, about how we provide, how we build a system that ensures student access without various players in a given district having conflict with a given CTE center in a way that results in lack of access instead of full access, and how I think you and Jen have been very intentional in your work with us in helping us think through design factors that would minimize that risk in ways that best support students.
Yeah, and I think building on that, Ruth, like one of the things we see in the current system is large variation in quality within program and across centers generally. And that's both on kind of what students are receiving, but also on the outcomes they have. And so I think one of the focuses on having the statewide lens is really trying to balance out that equity of opportunity for students. So if they're walking into a welding program in one part of the state or another part of the state, they really would expect to have the same curriculum, program, equipment. And so that, I think, was one of our main goals and why we did pull things up a little bit higher. And to Ruth's point, also getting rid of what could be some of the tensions that we do hear about even now between kind of sending districts and CT centers and pulling a lot of that up to that state level.
Justin, and I will say that the CTE team currently at the Agency of Education spends what I would characterize as a fair amount of time navigating and mediating those conflicts between sending districts and CTE centers in ways that we'd like to design a system that removes that tension.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you. This may be leading to what we're discussing about might be leading into this. I'm curious, how does the Unified Perkins Plan approach address some of the inconsistencies you've seen around the state if offerings in certain parts of the state may necessarily be different based on need or supply or what have you?
I think some of this is also related to establishing very clear goals for workforce development and aligning program development and expansion according to those goals. So that's a key piece of this work. Making sure that we're prioritizing those programs that are going to really prepare students for jobs here in Vermont. In terms of the kind of variation across the state, there may be different regional partners that may be involved in supporting, depending on kind of the industry demands for that part of the state. So I'd like for the team to kind of expand on that component, because we'll still want to have really strong industry partners. We see that happening in certain parts of our state, and other parts of our state that those advisories are not as strong. So there's some intentionality here too in strengthening of that industry alignment and support in a consistent, coherent way across the state.
I can speak to some of that first if you, okay. I think there are a few things that I think about. One, in our, as Justin and Jen mentioned, AOE currently does partner with our CTE centers to provide statewide teacher professional development. And so I get to spend good time with our CTE program teachers, and many of our program teachers would welcome an opportunity for more, at least regional, if not statewide, industry coordination to inform all of the things that our Perkins plan requires. And they're looking for more opportunities to do that, because in a small state, there may be key state resources or key industry partners who are then being asked to partner with a dozen different teachers and programs, and how could they not have to duplicate that work? And how could they better have access to those systems if they're more geographically removed, but their information would best support their students? So I think a systems design can address that. I also think about the fact that currently our system, and I think Jen and Justin's colleagues have pointed this out to me repeatedly over 2 years. I'm thinking about Gretchen and Jackie as I say this, but our current system means that because we have such a level of local development of each CTE program, we ask all of our CTE teachers, especially new teachers out of industry, to spend inordinate amounts of time designing their curriculum, designing what they teach, learning how to work with high school students, doing all those things. And a more coordinated Perkins State plan and a more coordinated system would provide them with base resources that would still allow them to use their individual skills and provide a lot of autonomy in how they meet learning objectives, but it would give them a different starting point than they have now. And I think teachers consistently talk about more resources, more shared opportunities, more curricular resources, more shared assessments, more commonality, and more time with peers who have done this for years, who are good at this, instead of being siloed and perhaps mentored in your building by someone who's never taught in your content area, are things that would strengthen our system and could be intentionally built into all of what's being discussed and into that unified Perkins plan.
And building just really quickly on what Ruth said there, one of the big goals of going to the CTE BOCES is aligning better what's happening in current programs and new programs to statewide workforce development goals. Like, that's an absolute want of this, or a goal. But we do not want to get rid of the local perspective either. But we want to, where we can, and I think Ruth probably just already said this, like, you have people who are on multiple boards around the state. You've got some boards that are really robust and some that aren't. Like, get a little bit better at actually having robust boards locally and making sure that we both have the statewide lens, but also that local lens at the same time. And we think the CTE staff can help support that, right? They can help build the connections and the relationships across the state to make sure that's happening, again, locally and statewide.
Go ahead.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Very helpful. It sounds to me, if I heard the presentation correctly, that the amount of funding for CTEs would be structured around what the median spending, I guess, is right now, around 2,500, 25. But of course there'll be there are some probably that are more than that right now, and probably some less. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the transition. If your target is median, there's some particularly that are higher, and you can manage that transition.
It's an important point with any sort of change, right? And when we're talking about standardizing more of our funding to make sure we're getting some consistent quality, will require support with that transition. So the intent really around the ability to be providing that specialized support as we're thinking about building the budget, ensuring that there's consistency in terms of the curriculum delivery across the state. Also built into this that we haven't expanded on is additional support for teacher induction and ongoing professional development as part of this plan. That's really important. So this plan comes with a lot of additional support to ensure that we are providing the resources, support from a curriculum and a budget perspective to help with that transition. There's also in this work and an evaluation of the existing programs. So there may be certain programs that are underutilized, and there may be certain programs that we need to expand, right? And so all of that work needs to be part of this transition with intentionality too around how to maximize those funding resources that are not just aligned to the state, but also aligned to the funding dollars that we invest.
Just a brief follow-up. Some senators might have long-term debt involved. I wondered if you thought about that issue.
So we certainly have that question overall with the broader transformation and understanding the debt management piece and also the reserve. So that is a subsequent analysis that's related both to CP and to our K-12 system that will come back and review. That has been requested and we'll follow that.
Representative
I think you
Heffernan?
wanted to expand on the support because I know you're very intimately involved with the support. So if anything of the transition.
This main is,
Okay.
it's about support. Where's that coming from? That additional support you were speaking of?
Yes. So it's twofold. So we've had, this is organized from the agency support in terms of oversight and monitoring, and then the LOC is providing that specialized support really related to the professional development, curriculum development, and implementation on the ground support. And Ruth, I'll let you expand on this. I know you're excited about the opportunity through this plan to expand support.
Very excited about the opportunity through this plan. And I also think about, as you dig more deeply into APA's full report, right? I encourage you to look at the help they've given us in really framing the need for us to really design a system that has intentionality about appropriate staffing for CTE. We certainly have, we'll need that transition in some of our more expensive CTE centers right now are bearing costs that ideally will shift to a BOCES, which will free up resources to be spent more directly on teaching and learning. And that's not a criticism of those centers that are spending more. Our system currently requires them to be able to, different people come with different centers come with different resources right now. And so some centers have to fully pay for certain things, whereas others have other systems that support that. APA's tried to design a model that says if those costs shift to a BOCES, what does that allow to actually do the day-to-day work of educating students? So that's how I think about it. But I also I certainly think about where we have room to be more deliberate. And one of the things I've thought about, I've been in this role since 2020, so almost 5 full years. And one of the things that's of consistent concern to me, we have some of our most amazing centers that scrape by with the fewest resources. And what they could do with just a little more and what they could do with the staffing that we see in our best resource centers just gives me such optimism for where we can go next, because they're doing so much with what they have, but they're not able to provide what they know they most need to best support their students. As an example that I think APA details well in their report, we have key academic support personnel in our CTE centers, when our data shows us that statewide, only about 47% of our CTE juniors and seniors are proficient on a reading language arts assessment that basically means they're reading at an end of middle school level. And we have CTE program teachers who are doing their best to integrate relevant literacy strategies, but we also have centers where they have dedicated teachers with that expertise to help partner with program teachers to better support students. And our data shows us that in some of our centers, without those resources, we're not even at that 47%. So how do we design systems that promote staffing that really improve student outcomes while shifting some of the things that some of our CTE centers have had to assume just because that's the way it is to a BOCES where we're providing it statewide for everyone? Jen or Justin, do you have any?
No, I think you nailed it.
That's great.
Senator Heffernan, did that answer your question?
That did, thank you.
Representative Greening?
Hi, thanks. So I appreciate that answer, Ruth, and I think we are all trying to figure out what this new system is that's going to allow us to have the least amount of layers maybe, or systems that stop funding from getting to students and getting the best outcome for our students. And so with that in mind, right, without, if we're looking at this from scratch, there's nothing there. I'm really thinking hard about what is governance and what is day-to-day and what belongs in which bucket, because I'm not sure that governance is the buildings, right? That any of that has to be part of it. Governance for me is Perkins and professional development and reporting and all of those kinds of things. Not necessarily payroll or hiring or things like that. And so I think that I see that they're here. I'm not sure that, I'm hoping that we're open to figuring out this new system together and what makes the most sense for governance and what, you know, how we use our resources to the best of our.
Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful question and it's important for us to map out. I think it resonates with a couple other questions we've already heard today, which is if we want to get it right, we want the right expertise in the right place in our system to support those excellent outcomes. So I think through this conversation of follow-up, it would be helpful is for us to identify the components that we're describing in terms of governance. And being able to bucket those according to the right level or the right entity that is supporting it. So you mentioned and making a distinction between some of the back office support versus the training versus monitoring and oversight and then accountability. And I think it is important for us to map out. It is kind of, I think, alluded to and applied within the report, but I do think this is the time for us to get really concrete in doing that mapping to make sure that we're very clear on those roles and responsibilities and ensuring that they're placed at the right level that can best support the system. So I think that would be great for us to provide as a follow-up. I know we do have a meeting scheduled on Thursday, so that could be an opportunity with your committee to begin do that more concretely. Thank you.
CTEs are currently required to provide adult CTE programming, or at least have an adult coordinator. Where does adult CTE fit into this, and is that requirement, does that requirement still hold?
Yes, so I'll agree to discuss this around the adult piece.
Adult CTE is one of those areas that we've identified needs significantly more work, and the Department of Labor is interested in partnering with us to really firm that up, because currently our adult CTE system, while there's a requirement in statute to provide adult CTE, the funding support for adult CTE does not make that viable for many of our CTE centers. So basically, adult CTE is an enterprise program, and CTE centers have to design adult CTE programs that bring in the revenue to support them. Some of our CTE centers have local budget funds to help support that, others don't. We have some centers that don't currently have an adult CTE coordinator due to a lack of resources and an inability to have those positions supported by budget. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm sure Jen and Justin will help us dig into moving forward, is what would, as we design what comes next for our CTE system, how do we intentionally design for adult CTE's role in that? And what's the right level of staffing for adult CTE to provide a coordinated system statewide? Because currently, some regions of our state have outstanding adult CTE programs and others have none. How do we better make sure that all have the right balance, and what's the right staffing and funding to provide that? And I know the Department of Labor is anxious to partner with us as we further expand on that.
The $25,000, I got a couple of questions about that. First of all, in the case of it being the median, did you just look at the cost per pupil of the 17 centers and pick the median? Or did you look at how many students were going at $34,000 a year and how many students were going at $27,000 and how many at $18,000?
Justin, as you respond to that, if you could orient the committee to the financial analysis as part of the more comprehensive report.
Yeah. So to your point, we did pick the median of the 17. We also looked at average. We didn't look at weighted average, so that's an interesting piece. We did look at within the report cost per quality, and what was interesting, if you just looked at those centers, and Jen, if please build on this if I mess it up, because Jen really wrote the section. If you looked at those who had the highest outcomes, who had the most support services, they all were still right in that $25,000 range. So it turns out you could be doing a very good job in a bunch of different ways, and that dollar amount was what was being spent to get that done.
Yes, we looked at both the difference to see if there were significant differences in the median across the part-time centers compared to full-time programs. And those, we looked at the Perkins indicator summaries. And so we took for a number of the CTE indicators that are used, the top 5 performing programs in the state on each of those indicators. And, there really was not much difference in the median, no matter if we looked at all of the centers, if we looked at part-time, full-time, those that provide academic support personnel compared to those that don't, compared to those that were really, top performing on those CTE indicators. There was some variation, but not significant variation. And so, given the data that we had, we felt pretty comfortable with that after looking at that $25,000 level.
Page 16 in the report, the full report is where the analysis begins. Also looks at different types of programs as well, and some different variations.
One of the challenging things is that everything is kind of tied together, and especially everything is tied to the 5-district model. If that, so the foundation formula is kind of based on the 5-district model, then therefore the 25,000 is based on the 5-district model. So, if we were to vary from that, how does that then change the $25,000 funding?
So
Is the modeling, can one model that at this point?
yeah, so any variation with either policy lever would require provides modeling. But there all about just thinking through the specifics around that. One thing that we're talking about in terms of the broader regions, it helps to support more continuity between the sending districts and the tech centers in terms of accepting the credits and have consistency around that, which right now we don't. So getting to that goal would be important to make sure that students that are taking the same courses get the same credit across the state. The actual adjustments in terms of the modeling we would need to do depending on what variations might come forward in terms of changes to that scale. Much of this is aligned to ratios. There's opportunities for us to do that to a certain point. So Justin, would you expand on that and help us think through?
Yeah, I think when you think of the funding that we've laid out for this CTE BOCES, I don't think the 25,000 would change. If you went to 11, I think I've seen 11 districts, or I think that number is the same. I think you'd want to think through if your base ended up being something different, we've got to think about those component parts. But I think that target funding amount, because we would still be recommending the single BOCES, is going to stay the same.
If we did nothing to change our system, would you still recommend going to this BOCES system?
I'm not sure I would call it the BOCES. I think I would hand you the report that is accompanied this, and maybe it's a district versus a BOCES. I think we would still recommend going to a single governance entity for CTE, which is my favorite term now, single governance entity.
The single governance entity, just to clarify, would all be supporting the student that are electrical grade at the tech center. To really achieve our goal of the early career exposure, we need to be thinking about funding with all that base amount for the middle school and early high school years.
And does the 25,000 represent funding for those exploratory programs?
No, that's built into the base amount. But in the BOCES would be supporting with creating that continuity. School to high school, but the funding itself for the early exposure is in the base.
So this is very much like our the major education overhaul language. We don't have legislative language for this proposal, I assume, yet.
Today we'll walk through this afternoon the legislative language that we have.
Okay.
And the CTE and this detail is not included in that.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So
Mr.
have a good.
So in the interim, that of the 25,000, what do we tell, there's basically 3 CTEs that are extremely over the $25,000. What are we, I have one in my district, and what would I have to tell them of how they are gonna survive until we get this aligned?
I think that question speaks also just to the transition, right? How do we support a really thoughtful, planful, and intentional transition that is supportive of student outcomes and recognizes that there needs to be some stabilization in our system as we move to this. So is the overall plan that we're outlining for education transformation is a multi-year plan. And it's looking at a 2-year ramp to transition to our funding. And as part of that, we're identifying ways in which we would be supporting with that very transition, both from a budgeting perspective, structural and academic perspective as well, to ensure that readiness for a transition. But I would like for Ruth to speak more concretely around the type of support that our knowledge on the ground of the different centers and ways in which we could be supportive of making that change. Ruth, if you could expand just on the transition as we think about, given that there was some variability in the funding at this point, how we would support those tech centers in getting to that optimal funding. I think as we've described, doing the cost for the quality in our piece, we know that you can deliver high quality at the cost that's being proposed. So that's an important starting point. And I think there are good practices overall in our system that we're looking to scale to achieve that optimum efficiency and outcome that we know is really happening across the system.
I think that says it all very well, and I do think there need to be that deliberateness in making sure that transition period allowed for exactly what's needed and plan for what comes next. But I do think, again, for some of our, and Justin and Jen have lived in this in far more detail than I have, but some of our more highly funded districts, CTE centers, have resources and positions and other opportunities. Some come from things that are built into the cost of doing business in their particular region, but there are other differences in staffing levels. There's a huge range of what our centers work with currently in terms of how many people they have to do certain things. And my best example to you is I was recently in one smaller CTE center with less staffing, and there was something that took the building administrator out of the building and someone was out sick. And I suddenly had this moment of realizing I was probably the only licensed school administrator on the campus. And so we have centers who are working with those realities, whereas others have robust resources. And then they may also have other positions. Some of our regional technical center school districts have had to have additional positions because they are a separate district. Over time, as they would shift to a BOCES, those positions they wouldn't each need their own HR person, their own payroll, their own grants folks. They have, and again, this is not to criticize, this is to say our current multiple forms of governance have led to multiple needs for staffing.
So you're saying
many of those staffing pieces aren't based on direct support to students. They're based on all the other things that go into maintaining a school and a system.
So to be clear, the BOCES is what we're hoping to save us in some of our costs on our hire, because we're paying for people that they won't need because of the BOCES. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think this gets to the earlier question and the need for a follow-up where we can actually map the specific responsibilities at the district capabilities at the AOE. But there certainly is some efficiency achievable with the support through the central.
Final question, Senator Weeks.
Thanks, sir. Just for clarity, the 25,000, you also add the student weights on top of that? If there's a student from poverty, English as a second language, et cetera.
So I'll allow Justin to speak through the funding, and when you do, Justin, you could also expand on that amount that stays with the district to provide that additional support.
Yes, the way we have been thinking about it, and we, I think, have to land on that final proposal, is that the costs that we use to get to 25,000 likely include the additional services for students who are economically disadvantaged. And so we think that probably is an available revenue. We would assume that the additional funding for EL and special education would be available to each student. And those would be coordinated services between the sending district and the center. So we'd have to work on that. And then, as Secretary Saunders was mentioning, districts would also have that additional 5,200 that stays with the sending district to do guidance counseling, other emotional supports if needed, making sure that there's the graduation requirements that are being met, and then helping with some of the scale issues that happen when, you know, one or two students leave a classroom from their sending school to go to a CTE center, right? Costs don't necessarily go down. And so it really helps support some robust coursework at the sending schools.
We have time for one more. Representative Olson, did you have a quick question?
Thank you. And I may have missed something in the ABA report, but it sounds like it was a question about, you know, where the savings come from to, you know, try to enhance CTE services. And it sounds like the sources, the scale issues around those. And my question, maybe it's been presented elsewhere. I've seen sort of financial analysis in other contexts around education that sort of specified, you know, here's where we get the savings, and it's usually personnel, these number of FTEs, administration, or whatever, are going to be eliminated, and these are going to be increased. Has that kind of been, because that would help sort of identify, I think, the question said now, you know, what are the savings?
Right.
That would be very helpful. I don't know if it's been done.
Okay. I'll put that on the agenda.
Okay.
As a follow-up. I think the approach to this work that I'll reinforce was around quality and consistency. We do see in achieving efficiencies that we have cost savings. And so I'm hearing your question around the need to get more concrete in itemizing that. But I do, just as a process point, this was really designed as a way to do quality and efficiency and scale. But I do understand, we need to understand what did that mean in terms of how we operate differently and where that cost savings would be. So I noted a couple of key takeaways from this conversation. And that one is to map the roles and responsibilities for governance, to continue to expand on adult education in partnership with CTE and Department of Labor. Continuing to have conversations with the transition support, and then the 2 years cost saves.
I would include under sort of future questions, how you transition a bunch of different CBAs into one CBA under one BOCES. I can't remember my other one. Oh, and there was a question about debt earlier.
I want to make sure I have all of the questions.
Representative Graining?
Half day versus full day.
There's assumptions around prorating that.
Yeah, funding isn't the same. How does that?
Yep.
Great. We will wrap there. Thank you very much to you and your folks.
Thank you very much.
CTE has needed a good, deep thought, and appreciate the work that's gone into it. It's been overdue. For